This is a true story about a young girl in Japan who became a victim to some of the most heinous and depraved members of the Yakuza syndicate. Be warned, there's some gruesome detail in this. Junko Furuta was a 17-year-old girl who attended Yashio Minami High School in Japan. Her peers often considered her very intelligent and kind, and it seemed she had a bright future ahead of her. Junko had a hectic schedule with school, and also participating in extracurricular activities. She also worked many hours each day at the local plastic molding factory to save money for a future. When she was in her last year of high school, she made plans to work at an electrical shop after graduating, hoping to go to university later. She never smoked, did drugs, got drunk, or even partied, and she always got home before it was too dark. However, an unfortunate consequence of being a kind, popular girl is that she didn't always attract desirable attention. One day during lunch, a boy named Hiroshi Miyano approached her and asked her on a date. Junko, not having any interest in Hiroshi, politely declined his request. Over the next few days, this infuriated Hiroshi. He wasn't used to people saying no to him, and he didn't take kindly to it, to say the least. Hiroshi was known by many as the school bully, and he often created fear among his fellow peers because of his antics. In a way, he had the polar opposite of Junko's reputation. He bragged about his connections to a local gang called the Yakuza, a gang known for being violent in that area. Often, members of the Yakuza would kidnap and gang rape innocent women. Hiroshi and his friends were no strangers to this kind of behaviour, and often preyed on vulnerable women at the local park. Because of the things he did, and the people he associated with, many people, including Hiroshi's parents, feared what he would do if anyone ever stood up to him. Hiroshi hated Junko so much for rejecting him that he believed that she was the appropriate next victim for him and his friends. For the next few days, Hiroshi and his gang friend, Shinji Minato, plotted their abduction of Junko and precisely what they would do to her. On the 25th of November, just 2 days after Junko's 17th birthday, the two boys would spot her riding her bike through a local park. Junko had just finished a shift at the factory, and because of this, she was tired and was riding slowly through the park. The boys waited till she passed them. Then Minato approached her from behind and kicked her off her bike. Miyano ran up to her, pretending to be an innocent bystander who was coming to her aid. He would then offer her a ride home, to which Junko cluelessly agreed. Miyano drove Junko Furuta far from the city to a secluded area. He eventually found an abandoned warehouse and told Furuta to go inside. At this point, Furuta knew something was wrong. However, she still did what he said, for fear of what would happen if she tried to escape. That's when Miyano told her of his affiliation with the Yakuza, and said that if she tried to run or make noise, he would kill her. Miyano then instructed her to take her clothes off, and proceeded to rape her and force her to masturbate for him for the entire evening. After he finished, he forced Junko Furuta back into his car, restraining her by her hands and feet. He drove back into the city to a park, different from the one where he kidnapped Furuta. At 3 AM, he met two more gang members, Joe Ogura and Yasushi Watanabe, as well as Minato. They drove her back to Minato's house, ridiculing her, calling her names, and telling her what they would do with her once they got back. To avoid raising his parents' suspicions, they pretended Furuta was Minato's girlfriend and took her into an empty room. The boys then forced her to strip for them and masturbate, while they all laughed and made fun of her. By day 2, the boys were afraid that they might get caught with her, or that people might have seen them kidnap her, so they made her call her parents to tell them that she had run away and was not coming back. At this point, her parents knew something was amiss, because this was completely out of character for Furuta. She had never done anything like this before. They immediately reported her as a missing person to the police, but there wasn't much else they could do. For the first few days of her abduction, the boys would bring over other Yakuza members, including Tetsuo Nakamura and Koichi Ihara, who forced her to strip naked and do various sexual acts in front of them, including dancing naked to music and masturbating in front of them. They also put a pillow over her head until she lost consciousness and gang raped her. After hearing screaming come from the room Furuta was in one night, Minato's parents would confront Shinji about what he was doing. But he told them that they were just playing games and there was nothing for them to worry about. How far from reality this was. The boys beat her with bamboo sticks, hung her from the ceiling, and whipped her for hours on end, sometimes so bad that she begged them to kill her. The boys also enjoyed laying her on her back with their hands and feet tied up, and dropping heavy dumbbells on her stomach until she lost bowel control. On the 11th day, her internal organs were so badly traumatized that whenever she tried to eat or drink the small amounts of food given to her, she would vomit it back up. And when she did vomit, she was punished with even harder beatings. By this point, Furuta had been missing for weeks, and the police were doing everything they could to find her. Unbelievably, the police even came to Minato's house twice and questioned him on whether or not someone was there. However, each time, they would somehow manage to convince the police that nothing was wrong. One day, while her captors were in another room, Furuta managed to sneak to the telephone and dial 911. But before she could speak, Minato hung up the phone and took her back to the room. As punishment, they poured lighter fluid on her legs and set them on fire until she started to convulse. Hiroshi Miyano would say during his trial that they thought she was faking a seizure, prompting them to shove fireworks into her genitals and ears. They also came up with the idea of forcing her to eat cockroaches and drink her own urine while they all laughed. The boys regularly put her inside a freezer and forced her to sleep there for the night, as well as leaving her on the balcony in the middle of winter with very little clothing. From day 11 to approximately day 20, she was raped by dozens of Yakuza men and continuously forced to do different sexual acts. Some say, in total, 100 different men raped her, somewhere between 500 to 600 times. And they would also bring things such as iron rods, scissors, and even hot light bulbs or lit matches to put inside her genitals. Around this time, Minato's parents figured out that Furuta wasn't her son's girlfriend at all, but was actually the missing girl from his school all along. However, instead of calling the cops, They pretended nothing was going on, in fear of what Minato would do to them if they did. They knew Minato was part of the Yakuza, and the threat of what they might do to them if they notified the police was enough to frighten them into turning a blind eye. By the 20th day, the burns and bruises on her legs and lower body were so horrific that she couldn't stand up straight anymore. One of the boys would later say that he saw her crawl for almost an hour downstairs to use the washroom, and then over 2 hours to get back up the stairs to the room. She couldn't grasp anything in her hands because they completely shattered the bones. They beat her so badly that she couldn't breathe through her nose because of the accumulation of clotted blood in her nasal cavity. However, by day 30, the boys would ramp things up even further, as if they hadn't done enough to her already. They repeatedly stabbed her chest with sewing needles and ripped her left nipple off with pliers. They also burnt her eyelids almost completely off with hot wax. Due to the head trauma she received from the beatings, her brain size had shrunk significantly, and they so severely damaged her eardrums from having fireworks shoved inside them that she was almost completely deaf. They covered her face with hot wax and left it to dry. Then, they peeled it off, causing a high amount of blood loss and pain one can't imagine. As the ordeal dragged even further, by day 40, she was constantly begging them to kill me and get it over with. They mutilated her body so badly that she couldn't move from the ground. She was also completely unable to urinate or defecate. And whenever she tried to eat or drink anything, her body would reject it completely, leaving her dying of starvation and dehydration. Her body smelled like it was rotting due to her burns getting infected, making the boys lose sexual interest in her. They played a game of mahjong with her, a popular Japanese board game. They claimed that they lost the game to her, which prompted them to mutilate and beat her body with an iron barbell. At this point, Furuta couldn't scream or even breathe properly anymore, and just remained silent to her torment, with the occasional moan in pain. They then held a candle flame up to her face and eyes for a few minutes to burn the surface of her skin. Lighter fluid was poured on her legs, arms, face, and stomach, then extinguished after a few seconds, only to light her on fire again. This torture lasted for 2 hours straight, and once it was over, they left her alone. On January 4th, 1989, 44 days after being abducted from the park, Furuta eventually succumbed to the brutality inflicted on her and died alone in excruciating agony. After she died, the boys wrapped her body in blankets and disposed of it in a 55-gallon oil drum. Miyano brought bags of concrete and filled the oil drum with cement. They then disposed of it in a tract in Koto, Tokyo. The boys would never speak of the crime to each other again. To the outside world, Junko Furuta was a girl who completely vanished after work one day and never returned home. No one outside the Yakuza gang, except Minato's parents, knew what had happened to the girl. However, one day, that would all change. On March 31st, the police brought Hiroshi Miyano in for questioning about a woman's disappearance, which was unrelated to the Junko Furuta case. They showed him a pair of women's underwear they found at Joe Ogura's apartment and asked him if he knew anything about it. The police kept the actual details of the crime vague, causing Miyano to panic, believing Ogura had already confessed to the kidnapping of Furuta. This led him to tell the police everything about Furuta, including how they kidnapped her, the names of everyone involved, what they did to her, even how and where they disposed of her body. Despite the odd circumstances surrounding Miyano's confession, the police believed everything he told them. The following day, on April 1st, they arrested and charged Hiroshi Miyano, Shinji Minato, Joe Ogura, and Yasushi Watanabe with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and assault. At the beginning of the trial, they hid the boys' names from the public because they were minors. They were simply referred to as A, B, C, and D. However, the media would discover their names shortly after and release them to the public, believing that the boys didn't deserve to have their identities concealed. Although they were charged with rape, assault, and murder, their charges got reduced to committing bodily injury that resulted in death after pleading guilty. Hiroshi Miyano, the leader of the group, was sentenced to 17 years in prison. He tried to appeal his case, but was denied and received an additional 3 years. This gave him a total of 20 years in prison, the maximum for a minor in Japan. Shinji Minato received a lenient sentence of 4 to 7 years. However, the judge extended his sentence to 5 to 9 years after a failed appeal. Minato's parents were not charged with anything, despite knowing what the boys were doing the entire time. Watanabe initially received 3 to 4 years in prison. However, the judge also upgraded his sentence to 5 to 7 years after he too was denied an appeal. Lastly, Joe Ogura received 8 years in prison. The public was understandably outraged with their sentencing, believing they deserved to go to prison for the rest of their lives. And to this day, all 4 of the boys are now living their lives completely free, without consequence, walking around the public streets just like you and I. After release from prison, Miyano, who the media considered the most notorious and evil of the group, received constant harassment from the public. He went to great lengths to hide his identity. However, in 2017, he was doxxed by 4chan, causing him to have to start all over again. He hasn't really been seen since then. One of the boys even allegedly has a social media account. However, I couldn't find proof of this. In 2019, at 46 years old, Shinji Minato was arrested again and went on trial for attempted murder after slashing his co-worker's throat with a knife. There's very little information on the outcome of the trial, but it's certainly safe to assume that he's in prison again, considering there was a lot of evidence against him. As for Junko Furuta's family, her parents sued Shinjo Minato's parents for not intervening with the boys when they knew they held Junko captive. They received 50 million yen in compensation, equivalent to 338,000 US dollars. Junko Furuta was also awarded a high school diploma in June of 1989, which was given to her parents. Junko's funeral was held on April 2nd, 1989, and at the funeral, this memorial was given by one of her friends. This is by far one of the worst cases I've ever read. It's almost impossible to put into words what must have been going through Junko's head during her captivity, and we may never know the full details of what she went through. It's hard to believe that after 44 days of the worst torture you can imagine, her captors got as little as 3 years in prison. That being said, her story illustrates what the most heinous and evil among us are capable of. And this is a crime that was ultimately solved. How many other young women were captured by these and other sick individuals whose stories we will never learn of? How many more victims are unaccounted for, with their parents never knowing what happened to their children? It doesn't bear thinking about. If you liked watching the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, because there's a lot more content like this coming out shortly. Thank you for watching.